All right, guys, welcome back to class. And what we want to do in this video is we want to go ahead and look at the first two of four core ideas related to cognitive behavior theory. As we did at the beginning of the semester when we talked about behavior theory, one of the things that I try to do whenever I teach a class like this is to take these core theories, these core helping approaches, and try as best we can to kind of break them down into just kind of their core basic beliefs, realizing that there's no way that we could cover every single little thing that every single theory teaches. But it's a great way to kind of learn about these different theories, is to kind of just take the basic foundational ideas and approaches and learn about them that way. So there are four core ideas related to Albert Ellis's CBT, cognitive behavior theory, and I want to review the first two of those with you in this little video, and then in our part B of module 3, next week we're going to look at the last two, and that'll kind of wrap our class up basically. Like I said in the last video, for some of you this is maybe the first time that you are being introduced to cognitive behavior theory. Others of you, this is a review because maybe you had class with Professor Como, or you had class with me, or Professor Lewis, or someone else where you talked about cognitive behavior theory. And so this may sound somewhat kind of familiar to you, but that's okay. It's good repetition and good reinforcement, as we would say, in behavior theory. So cognitive behavior theory, first core idea is this. If you and I are going to understand CBT, is we have to understand cognition. That's what this theory is called, cognitive behavior theory or therapy. So the first core idea is that this theory focuses on what you and I call cognitive behavior, our thinking or our thoughts or our beliefs. And what it proposes is that you and I are always talking to ourselves. Basically, that's the basic idea behind core idea number one, is this theory proposes and teaches that you and I are thinking beings, that we are wired in a way, our brain, our mind is wired in a way to where we are always talking to ourselves. Now let's talk about that talking to ourselves for a little bit. So we oftentimes use a bunch of different words to refer to the talking to ourselves part of us, this part that goes on, this behavior we would say that goes on in our mind. We oftentimes talk about talking to ourselves, or sometimes you may have heard the word self-talk. That's a good Albert Ellis CBT word. We sometimes just use the word beliefs or believing or belief systems, or we use the word thinking or thoughts. Occasionally we might use the word conscious. It's that conscious part of us. It's that voice inside of our head. We also use the word perception. We sometimes use the word attitude. So if you've ever heard anyone talk about another person with a bad attitude, often what they're referring to is really the way in which they look at the world. It's their perception, it's their attitudes, their beliefs, it's their thinking or their thoughts, or it's cognition or cognitive behavior. All of those words really are synonymous with each other for this conversation. They all basically mean the same thing. So this theory is called cognitive behavior theory because it puts an emphasis on that part of us, this thinking, thought, belief part of us. You know, we've already talked before about how every theory, one of the ways to learn the difference between the different counseling approaches is to look at what they emphasize and de-emphasize. And we talked about that back a little ways with behavior theory. You may remember that behavior theory focuses on human behavior, and it de-emphasizes emotions. It de-emphasizes, labels and behavioral labels. That's one of the things that makes it a distinct helping approach. Well, the main thing that CBT emphasizes is cognition. That's why it's called cognitive behavior theory. So that's the first thing that we have to understand about this theory is this theory, this helping approach is interested in that part of us or someone else, the thinking part between our ears, the cognitive behavior. And like behavior theory sort of taught us that behavior is always happening, Ellis was a believer that you and I are always talking to ourselves. As long as we are awake, our mind is engaged in the world around us. We're always thinking and processing and perceiving and believing all the time. Now, sometimes we use language like this. I don't know what I was thinking. I've had clients before when I asked them, so what was kind of going through, what were you thinking about at that moment? And they would say, Well, Glenn, part of the problem is I wasn't thinking at all. We use that kind of language. But technically, CBT would say that kind of language is not accurate because we are always talking to ourselves. So cognitive behavior and the idea that we are always talking to ourselves. Now, here's kind of the tricky thing. We're going to talk more about this next week with core idea number 4 especially. Well, 3 and 4 really. Even though we are always talking to ourselves, we may not realize it. It's possible that we aren't aware that we're always talking to ourselves. Well, why is that? Well, 2 main reasons. Number 1 is the idea that the way in which we talk to ourselves is often silent or quiet. And that's because on any given day, our brain has multiple things it's trying to do as far as us paying attention or whatever it might be, and us processing information and doing different things or whatever it may be. And so that talking to ourselves is oftentimes quiet or it's silent. It's there, but we just kind of block it out because we just have stopped hearing it, right? And so our brain oftentimes gets desensitized to the conversation that we're continually having in our head. You may remember from our conversation in the last module of this idea of the exposure therapies that says that anything that you and I are around all the time, we stop listening to or noticing because we get desensitized to it. Well, that happens with our mind. We're always talking to ourselves, and so we're not always aware because that talking or that conversation we're having is there, but we just don't hear it. I oftentimes share the example, maybe you've had this example. I went to Walmart one time and I bought a really expensive watch like they sell at Walmart, right? Like $9.99. I needed a watch really quickly. I was in Walmart. I grabbed a watch at Walmart. This is several years ago. I put it on. I brought it home. Well, what I didn't know was the watch was set to beep really loud every hour. So every hour on the hour, it would make this loud beeping noise. Well, I didn't want it to make the beeping noise. So I tried to turn it off and I couldn't because I had thrown away the instructions. So I tried a couple of times to turn the watch off so it wouldn't beep on the top of the hour, and I couldn't get it turned off. So the first couple of days I had the watch, when it beeped every hour, I heard it. It got my attention, right? Because it was new. It was new to my environment. I wasn't used to it. And so it would beep every hour. Well, if you've been in situations like that, and you have, guess what happened after 3 or 4 days? I stopped hearing it. Now, the watch kept beeping. It beeped 24 times every day at the top of the 24 hours. I just stopped noticing it. I'd be wearing it, driving down the road, it'd beep. I wouldn't even pay attention to it. I'd be sitting in a meeting. I'd be sound asleep at night. It'd be on my dresser. It would beep at the top of the hour. I didn't even wake up. Well, the issue wasn't the watch not beeping. It was beeping. My brain was blocking it out because it was just it would become desensitized, we would say. And so I stopped hearing it. It was there, I just didn't hear it anymore. Well, the same thing is true with our self-talk and how we talk to ourselves. It's always there. We just don't hear it because we've just gotten so used to it, we just kind of block it out. So we would say that our self-talk is oftentimes quiet or silent or quiet. And that's one reason why we aren't always aware that we're talking to ourselves. And the second is the idea of automatic or quick. So the 2 cues here are quiet and quick, right? So the way our brain is wired, our brain moves quickly. And so the conversations that we have with ourselves in our mind are not usually super slow. They're fast, right? They're really fast. So our mind is always thinking, it's always like a step ahead of us. Doesn't feel like it sometimes, but our mind works quickly. And so because our mind works quickly, we don't always notice and catch ourselves talking to ourselves because it just kind of happens. It's just, it's somewhat automatic or it's somewhat kind of quick. Our brain is just wired that way to where on any given day, you and I go through the day and we're making decisions up here. We're making perceptions up here. We're saying things up here in our mind all the time. But most of the time, it's not this slow kind of conversation, right? It's just boom, 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 real fast. So because of that, because it's quick or automatic, it's easy for us to get in the pattern of not realizing that we're even talking to ourselves. So we're going to talk more about that next week. We'll talk about core idea number 4. where from a counseling perspective, if you ever use CBT, either on yourself or as a helper with a client, the first thing people have to learn how to do is listen for their self-talk and begin to learn to pay attention. It's there. You and I will hear it if we start listening for it. And we'll talk next week about that, about the idea of listening for it, because there are ways that we can do that. And I've never had anyone who I ever used these kinds of approaches with ever say, no, I didn't hear anything. I listened for what I was saying to myself and I didn't hear anything at all. If you and I can learn to listen for our self-talk, we'll hear it because it's there. We just don't always realize it's there because it's oftentimes quiet or silent, or it's quick or automatic, okay? So first core idea number one, we're always talking to ourselves, and we sometimes use words like beliefs or thoughts or self-talk or cognition or cognitive behavior to refer to this talking to ourselves piece. Starts there. You can't understand CBT unless you grab onto that idea that we're always talking to ourselves. Second idea is this. It's the A, the B, and the C. And you may be saying, well, hang on, wait a minute. I know the A, the B, and the C. We just did that a couple of weeks ago. Antecedent behavior consequences. There you go. You got it. A little bit of a twist, though. Albert Ellis, I shared with you in the last video, initially was trained in Freudian psychotherapy. And kind of as he began to get away from Freudian psychotherapy, he became interested in behaviorism, we would say, or behavior therapy. And he really liked it. He kind of liked how behavior theory was sort of the opposite of Freud's approach. It was a little more concrete. It was a little more black and white, a little more basic, and he liked it. One of the things that Ellis really liked was the A, the B, the C. The idea that something happens around me, an antecedent or a trigger. I do something in response, behavior. And as a result of my behavior, I experience consequences, which then influence what I do next. A, B, C. So Ellis basically borrowed that idea with cognitive behavior theory, but he put a little bit of a twist and a tweak on the B and the C. The A basically stays the same. A is not antecedent, but activating event. And Ellis just chose the word activating event because he thought it was a little bit more understandable to the average person. The term antecedent is a scientific term. I don't think in all my years of working with people, I've ever used the word antecedent with them. Like in a counseling session, I've never said, well, what's the antecedent? That's just a word that most people don't know what that is. But the term activating event is just more of a modern day word. It means the same thing. So Ellis's idea was an activating event is like an antecedent, something happening around me. It's life. The term life happens is a good term that goes with A. Ellis often would say to people in counseling, you know, life happens to all of us. So what was kind of going on in your world that day? Tell me a little bit about what was just kind of going on. Not what were you doing, but what was going on in your world that day? You know, because life happens to all of us. That's A, and activating event. And clients would say, well, I woke up late, and then my daughter was sick, and I went out in my car, I had a flat tire on it, all that stuff that just kind of is around us all the time, right? And so activating event can be an event that happens to us or around us. It could be like an antecedent, someone's behavior, someone else's behavior. It could also be something within us. Kind of like we talked about with the antecedent a couple modules back. An antecedent could be me being bored, or me being hungry, or me being tired, or me being disinterested. Something like that could also be an activating event. So A is activating event. So kind of the idea with CBT, with this theory, is just like with behavior theory, Ellis kind of believed that what happens is we go through the day and life is happening around us all the time. A, activating event. And what happens next is B. Now B is not behavior, B is belief. So that's the new B. So this is a little bit of the first little tweak that we have here. So let me kind of walk you through how this theory sort of sees it. This theory says that as you and I go through life, we experience all kinds of activating events. And what happens is we're always talking to ourselves about those events. We just don't realize it because, again, that talking is often quiet and quick. But we go through life, we wake up late. Our daughter is sick. It starts raining. our professor is late to class, or whatever it may be, just life. And what happens is we give meaning through our beliefs to what's happening around us. So the B with cognitive behavior theory is beliefs. It's not behavior, it's beliefs. Now again, there could be a lot of words that go with this B. Thoughts, thinking. We could say cognitive behavior. Just keep it simple though. It's beliefs. It's talking to ourselves. So Ellis believed that, and this is a key idea, Ellis believed, and this theory teaches, that thinking comes first. I remember being introduced to that idea as a student many years ago. I had a professor who was teaching basically a counseling theories class in my graduate program. And I remember he was a big believer in CBT, and like I shared with you last video, I was then taught a couple semesters later in my clinical practicum, I was kind of taught how to begin using this theory. And I remember my professor, when we covered this theory, him saying over and over again, this theory teaches this important idea. Beliefs come first. Emotions don't come first. Behavior doesn't come first. Before we feel something and we do something, we think something. Think something, feel something, do something. The think, though, comes first. We just don't realize it. But Ellis believed, and this theory is built on this idea, that we're always talking to ourselves and it comes first. We go out and we find our car tire flat. That's A. In the split second, we give meaning to that event, and then we feel or do blank, right? But the meaning, the belief, the perception, the thinking, the self-talk, that comes first. B is belief. We talk to ourselves and tell ourselves something about the event. The B, right? The A. And we'll talk next week about some of the things we tell ourselves, right? But just for this conversation, we're keeping it pretty simple. A is activating event. B is beliefs or thinking, thoughts, self-talk, or whatever. Beliefs come first. So C stands for consequences, but there's a little bit of a twist here, right? So the C is consequences, but not just any kind of consequences. Back in the behavior mod, A, B, C. You remember we talked about social consequences and material consequences and, biochemical. We had pretty broad. In cognitive behavior theory, the C is a little more narrow. It's not just any kind of consequences. There are two types of consequences under C. Real simple. Here they are. Feelings and outward behavior. Emotional and behavioral consequences. So here we go. Again, this is an idea today that we use all the time in counseling, but when Ellis proposed it back in the 60s or whenever, it was pretty controversial and it was pretty interesting. So Ellis basically just taught this theory teaches that when we talk to ourselves, B, that how we talk to ourselves influences how we feel and what we do, and that's C. So the idea here, see I'm walking, the idea is our feelings and our outward behavior is just a consequence of our thinking, is key idea. Our feelings and our outward behavior are just a consequence of our thinking. So B is beliefs, and how we talk to ourselves influences how we feel and what we do. So the idea, there's an old phrase that basically, I give you in your lecture notes, the old phrase is the phrase beliefs influence behavior. Beliefs influence behavior. It's an old idea, but it kind of came in a way from Albert Ellis. The idea that anything you see in me outwardly, any behavior, any reaction, anything I see in you outwardly is really just a reflection of what you're thinking or believing up here. That our beliefs come out through our behavior, and that all we do all day long is behave, but our behavior is just an extension of what we believe and what we think. Beliefs influence behavior, but also too, beliefs influence emotions. And again, there's all kinds of theories out there and kind of research on, well, where do our emotions come from? Feelings. You know that behavior theory kind of de-emphasizes emotions, and CBT is not as interested in emotions as it is thinking, right? And so there's been some different ideas through the years about, well, if Glenn feels angry or feels happy or feels whatever, where does that come from? Is it just biochemical? Is it just a brain process? Or is there a psychological component? And most people believe that most of the time our emotions have that's not just a biochemical process, there is an emotional, there is a psychological process. Well, here's what that means. Sometimes the reason why I feel the way I do is connected to how I'm looking at my situation in my world. And so how I'm looking, my mindset, my beliefs will oftentimes drive my emotions, right? So if you ever work in clinical work or counseling, you'll have clients who will sometimes say, I don't know why I feel like that. I don't know why I'm blank, angry, excited, relieved. We use like an emotion word. You say, well, how does that make you feel? I say, I don't know, kind of upset, I guess. You say, tell me about that. And they may say, I don't know why I feel like that. Well, CBT, this theory would say, well, here's why we feel anything we feel. Our emotions are just a consequence, C, of our beliefs, B. So if I'm feeling angry about a situation emotionally, it's because I am defining my situation. I am talking to myself in a way about myself, the world, or other people that naturally produces anger. Maybe in my mind, I believe I'm being cheated. I'm being unappreciated. I'm being threatened. I'm being disrespected, whatever. And that is what's stemming and causing, you might say, influencing my anger, is because, the idea that perception and beliefs come first, then feelings. And that feelings are just driven by our perception. If my perception is whatever, I'm telling myself in this situation that it's impossible to fix. I'm believing in my mind or thinking in my mind that no one's listening to me. Well, that's kind of what I'm believing or thinking, whatever it may be. Then naturally I'm going to feel frustrated, upset, disrespected, or whatever, right? So this is this idea that beliefs come first. Activating event, then we talk to ourselves about it. That's B, beliefs. And then our thinking and talking to ourselves naturally produces feelings and behaviors, emotional and behavioral consequences. So a little bit of a twist on the first ABC that I gave to you. Each one's a little bit different. A basically is left alone, just has a new name. Instead of antecedent, activating event. B got a little bit of a twist to it. It's not any behavior, it's cognitive behavior, thinking, thoughts, beliefs. That kind of behavior is the B with this new ABC. And the consequences is not any consequence, it's emotional and behavioral consequences. So kind of like I tell you with all these videos, make sure that you look at the PowerPoint presentation, which kind of matches this little mini lecture. I know a lot of people are used to these days looking at PowerPoint. So I've got a PowerPoint presentation posted for you. I've got some lecture notes that I know many of you have been looking at and reading. I've got that kind of in black and white for you to kind of read through. It's a little summarization of what I just said in this little mini lecture. I may have some handouts posted for you, video. I got case study posted for you, all of that, right? So 2 key ideas in this first section of CBT. We talked in the last video about just a basic introduction into who Albert Ellis was and where CBT comes from. And then in this video, these first 2 key ideas. Number 1, we're always talking to ourselves. Number 2, the A, the B, and the C. Activating event, beliefs, almost said behavior, beliefs, emotional and behavioral consequences. All right, so I'll see you next module, and we're going to talk about core idea number 3 and number 4. See you then. Have a good week.